So I'm delighted to welcome our next speaker for the afternoon, Dr. Anthony Haughey. He lectures on the BA Photography and is a PhD supervisor in the Centre for Socially Engaged Practice-Based Research. In addition to teaching, Anthony is a socially engaged artist, photographer and filmmaker whose artworks have been exhibited, collected and published nationally and internationally. Anthony was a senior research fellow at the Interface Centre for Research in Arts, Technologies and Design in Belfast School of Art, where he completed a PhD in 2009. He's a member of the editorial board for the Routledge Journal of Photographies and is chairperson of Fire Station Artist Studios. Anthony recently completed his term as Decade Centenary's Artist in Residence at the National Museum of Ireland. Absolutely delighted to welcome Anthony.
Your presentation should be there. Okay.
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah, great.
Thank you. Thanks, Catherine. And thank you for the invitation. It's great to be here. So I'll start with an introduction. I work as an artist and an academic. I co-founded this research centre in TU Dublin, which is dedicated to socially engaged art practices. So really what's happening there, people who've had long kind of art careers, they come back and they take some time out to begin to reflect on that period of time. And so far, I think we've graduated about 20 PhDs over that period of time. But it's also importantly developing kind of methodologies around socially engaged art. And connected to that, we're also working on a publication which is due out next year. Cork University Press are doing it. So we spent the last 4 years like really incredibly detailed work looking at or developing an anthology of Irish artists who have these really incredible practices in Ireland that often I think go unnoticed. So I think this book will kind of internationalize that in a particular way. But really what I'm here to talk about today is Young People's Assembly. In the summer of 21, I had applied through an open call to the National Museum of Ireland. It was one of 5 national cultural institutions who had developed residencies around the decade of centenaries. But this one was quite unique insofar as it was, the call out was for a socially engaged artist. So in other words, it wasn't somebody who would have a studio practice and disappear inside the walls, quite the opposite. So my role really was to trouble the museum in all aspects. And some really interesting things came out of that, particularly around something that I kind of had a suspicion about, but we don't see in public. The colonial legacy of museums is very much present in the National Museum, things that haven't been dealt with yet, things that we inherited from the British Empire, some of those early collections. And eventually I got access to that. A really amazing story emerges from that as well. That was one of the last kind of projects that I did. But we don't have time to talk about that. So what I am going to talk about is, excuse me, Young People's Assembly, which became a central element of the outcome of the exhibition following the residency. And in 2022, going into 23, I was curious about, the decade of centenaries was really important. It's looking at the formation of the state. And lots of historians were revising, hidden histories. And for me, one of the most important things that comes out of that are women's histories. Women revolutionaries who are really just written out. So that period of time over the last 10 years of reinscribing women into that narrative became really important and quite informative really in this work that I made. So the exhibition itself ran from last February till July, so it only closed quite recently. And the idea was to invite people to speculate on a future egalitarian republic which hasn't arrived. And this was something that came together through the residency, not something that was kind of, prescribed, but it happened very organically through the process. So there's a number of key projects: a transcultural dialogical encounter between the museum collection and audiences, a short film asserting post-colonial narratives entangled in the museum ethnographic collections. And the culmination of the residency is still being negotiated, but what that will look like is what artworks enter the museum, what the archive will look like. Part of my role in the museum as well was to actually intervene in the collections, to make something that could trouble the collections, that we might actually think transculturally where we sit today in relation to Ireland's 20, 30 year transition into a much more multi-ethnic country. So to change that was, a really important kind of idea. And actually, again, I don't have time to go into that particular project, but maybe we can discuss it at the end. So, Young People's Assembly. This installation view from the exhibition. So the idea was to think about how to engage young people in active citizenship, or actually maybe more importantly for me was to think about, well, what does democracy look like in Ireland at this period of time, particularly in light of the growing far right? How do we speak back to that? How do you create a collective resistance to that kind of approach, or what was happening on the streets? So this was something I was really interested in, as well as what I spoke about earlier, the idea that instead of looking back across the first 100 years of the state, to start looking forward. And who would be the ideal people to ask this question to? So this was a genuine research question. I was thinking of 15 to 18-year-olds in transition in school, becoming adults. Who would ask them real questions about the future, their own position in relation to key issues that they think they would have to deal with in their lifetimes. So the process involved finding the schools. They had to be, for me, kind of representative geographical spread across the island. That included Belfast. It involved a lot of workshops. It involved a lot of traveling to these areas, north, south, east, and west. It involved acknowledging our language. Part of the proceedings of the assembly were in the Irish language, and that became really important as well. One of the notable things, I suppose, and you'll see in a video clip later, one of the young women speaks to this. The idea that the makeup of our doll these days is still, it's quite elderly in effect. The average age is 40s, 50s. In 1918, it was much younger, in fact. The average age was something like 37. So it's steadily increased over that period of time. The other notable thing, there's only about 22% of women represented in the doll. So all of these things start to emerge through the assembly, and particularly through the voices of these young people. So the schools were identified and workshops happened in these schools. I'll just talk a little bit about that process because that was interesting. The idea as an artist to go into a school and propose to take these groups of young people through art teachers and through the history teachers and think about how they might become young politicians, how they might think about democracy, what is their role in the world, how will they take on the next generation, what are they thinking about? And these were the kind of questions that were raised through both a historical lens and a contemporary lens by rereading the idea of what democracy actually looks like. And some surprising things came out of that. When I did the first one in Ennistimon, I think, and I wasn't sure if it was going to work. But really within minutes in the room, the enthusiasm was incredible. And these really, really genuine responses, and maybe surprised to being asked by, somebody who's not their teacher. It's off the school agenda, so to speak. So people, youngsters were encouraged to speak their minds, So I had lots of questions about, are these youngsters just going to mirror their parents' views? Or are they genuinely like kind of blue sky thinking about how they might change things in the future? And it was a little bit of both in the end, I think. So this was the second stage. I was thinking about where would this assembly happen. The original thinking was that it would be somewhere within the vicinity of each school. It might be a school, gymnasium, or a big space in particular towns. In the end, logistically, that was never going to work out. And it was actually more exciting. It worked out really well to think about like a key location that ended up being in proximity to the actual door. I'll speak about that a little bit in a minute. The other element was to build a table that would flatten out the idea of hierarchy. So school children, my position here, it's one of power. It's speaking down in a way. We're not in the, particularly in the round, but that idea of, one person who holds the floor. So we wanted to kind of remove that from the equation. So I was thinking about the UN-style assembly table. I designed the table, and eventually we found a space to work in. So these are some of the images of the workshops. During the workshops, one of the outcomes was at the end of the day, each group voted for their own Ciancola within the group. So the idea that, the first test, if you like, of democracy was within the school groups. So each one of the people or one of the youngsters in that group would become, chair of proceedings. That was interesting in itself. And some of the comments actually from teachers at the time saying, well, the person that was chosen, they're not going to be able to do it. And of course, they were brilliant. Everybody kind of rose to the occasion. So it comes back to that kind of fundamental question. If somebody genuinely asks you a question at that age, what do you think about the world? How do you see yourself positioned in the world? It doesn't happen, but something kind of, I don't know, something quite magical happens through that process, I think. So coming back to the idea of what space it would be in, where it would be located, the logistics of that were interesting as well because we wanted to film it. In the end, the museum offered me this beautiful room, the ceramics room. I don't know if anybody knows it. It's in the Museum of Archaeology. And it shares a neighboring wall with the door. The Shannon had sat there during the Shannon restoration. So it already had its own kind of energy. It already had like a really strong context in which to kind of make this work in. So the idea was to capture it. What's interesting, I think, with younger people, I've noticed this as an artist, that in front of cameras, when I think of years ago, trying to film with people, it was much more difficult. I think we've moved into a culture where younger people are so comfortable in front of cameras, the selfie generation. So even that idea of the sensitivity around documenting this process was really interesting because they were all incredibly natural performers with incredible confidence and incredibly articulate. Following the workshops, each member of the duly elected assembly was invited then to do a really deep research about one particular issue that they'd identified during the workshop. And then they worked with their history and art teachers, and over the next period of months, they really did do very deep research, came back with really important facts and figures around key issues, around, issues around racism, issues around, gender identity, issues around United Ireland, all these kind of issues that are, they're in the ether, but they seem to be really connected to it. The final stage, and that's going on now, is thinking about how this might kind of generate a wider discourse or a wider conversation. So I was working closely with the education department in the museum, and they were really keen to, when the exhibition was actually on, made a film, documented the whole process, and pulled together a toolkit for schools. During the actual exhibition, there was a lot of groups coming in to use it as a forum, to use it as a way to kind of examine these ideas of democracy, examine ideas of protest, examine their own position in the world. So this is one of the forums. It ran for 4 days. It was public. The structure around the table, I think it consisted of about 5 cameras and audio techs constantly moving around the room. So the idea for that was, how do you document and use that material in the future? So we wanted to do something quite elaborate in the end, and also thinking ahead to an installation I was going to make. So all of this had been kind of mapped out in some ways. So you begin to get an idea of the energy in the room. What I'm going to do is show you a couple of short clips from proceedings, just to give you a flavor. The finished documentation, the duration is about 7 hours, and that will also go into the museum collection. And that was installed with fidelity in the museum. The idea of kind of selecting from that, the instinct as an artist might be to take, a few minutes clip, but the importance of kind of making the relevance within the museum that connects back to the archive as well as its kind of contemporary nature. All of that became really important. This is Victoria, who is an incredible performer and decided that she would be on the poster. And that was important as well. When you think the first point of contact with this exhibition was at the Lewis stop in front of the museum. And given what had been happening in Dublin over the last year or two with the far right movements and even rioting and so on, the confidence of this young woman to say, yeah, I'm really happy to represent this exhibition, to be facing literally out onto the street, and with confidence to say, I'm here. Yeah, quite special. What I'm going to do now is show you a short clip from Victoria speaking about the issue that she wanted to raise at the forum.
I want to discuss the topic of Black women being misrepresented in the media. I am an angry Black woman. Not a Black woman who happens to be angry, but an angry Black woman. When I'm angry, I'm not human. I'm character. My pain is showcased as a play for all to see. If I'm not composed at all times, I'm a circus for entertainment. But my emotions are not a performance. My joy is valid. My fear is valid. My pride is just as valid as anybody else. Yet why is my anger such a point of contention? Look to the media. What do we see? A white protagonist who is thoughtful and timid. Then turn to her friend, a combative, loudmouth, sassy girl. The image in your mind is of a Black woman, I guarantee. We point and laugh at her outburst, willing her to perform another trick. But our protagonist is not amused. She stands for a change and is applauded. For an angry white woman, it's overcoming adversity. But an angry Black woman is the adversity. I question all of you listening. What would you do if no matter how hard you tried, how hard you fought, you suffered, if all of your accomplishments went unrecognized? Obviously, you'd be angry. But imagine if your hard work went unnoticed, but your indignation did not. Being unrelentingly downtrodden and finally reacting in a human way is accepted as a person reaching their wit's end. But for Black women, quite the opposite. We are characterized, satirized, and mocked. On social media especially, we are Shaniqua, Latifa, etc. But we are not scholars, not athletes, not free thinkers. We are sassy, snappy, funny, not serious, until we are seen as threats. Our spaces are invaded, our culture and ideas stolen, and we are unable to argue. All those phrases people love to say, the fashion trends you engage in, stolen off the backs of Black women who continue to suffer to this day. Why is that? Because we Black women are seen as violent and aggressive people. Violence and aggression are lobbied against us. For every white woman who reports domestic abuse, there are 3 Black women who are unable to speak up. Speak up. Angry. A vicious cycle doomed to be repeated until we all put a stop to it. Until we can all say this has gone on for far too long. Until that day arrives, I will be an angry Black woman, and I will not be silenced.
And I'm going to show you one more clip. So this is just one example from many, and it's extraordinary. And this is just the tip of the iceberg. And so many issues are raised across the spectrum, from climate change to, as this example here, racism. The language is really important. All of these things that I kind of thought there's something quite special going on here. Maybe it's a new generation that just seem to be much more politically conscious, but it was there for sure. I'm going to play a short clip now from Roisin, who speaks post-assembly, and it's just kind of a short reflection on some of the issues that it raises for her in relation to young people's voice, in relation to how she feels young people should be positioned in relation to the future.
I found that.
Sorry about that.
I found that the environment was very encouraging to speak your mind, and even as the Ceann Comhairle, I would have, some sort of authority or order over the assembly, but being, that kind of shape, we were all the same as one another, which I found really important because it encouraged everyone to say exactly what they felt and not be worried about what the person above them or behind them or next to them thought, which I feel like with young people, especially in secondary schools, they're very conscious of what they think, and even the way the authority distribution is, you respect the teachers, you respect your elders. Now obviously you respect your elders and everyone around you, but even in terms of voicing your opinions, sometimes students feel stifled by all the rules and norms. And as a society student, I study this quite a lot in the distribution of power and decision making in school. So I found the layout of the assembly really insightful to the kind of dilemmas that students face and young people face when trying to voice their opinions. And even in class the other day, we were discussing about how there was a lack of representation of young people in the DAL, and how the average age is around 40, which when you are running a country, you're looking at the future and you're looking at what needs to happen and what needs to change. You are looking at the present, but you're certainly not looking at the past. And it's our future generations' world that we are building and we are creating. Where everyone, all the eligible voters and the people in the DAL to recognise they need to listen to young people, because in the end of the day, in 10, 20, 30 years' time, it's going to be us that's running the show. We're going to be the ones in power, and we're going to be the ones, living this world that they've created for us with all the laws and legislation. And then when we get to that stage, it's important for us to realise that the world that we grow up in now is going to be very different. So we then, in turn, need to listen to our younger generations. So I think it's really important that that point gets across, that we need to listen to everyone, because we're always need to look forward into the future.
And this is how the installation looked inside the museum. The idea now, everything inside the museum, I mean, one of the wonderful things as an artist working in a national institution is, the level of resources you have in a museum compared to contemporary art spaces, they're just worlds apart. So you can do things that just wouldn't be possible. Even down to the structure of this exhibition, everything was handmade, from drawings, like these sculptural installations for the monitors and so on, all made, everything was made from scratch, so to speak. So everything was bespoke. The idea might be to, I think Ireland has the presidency in Europe in 26, and I'm thinking, wouldn't this be an amazing piece of work to take to Brussels and elsewhere? So we'll see. So what was the outcome? That's important as well. I mentioned in this kind of the structure that I described, a manifesto, and that became hugely important as well. So the outcomes for each assembly were documented and then brought together under one document. There was a special edition printed on handmade paper. It approximated very subtly the proclamation, only in scale. That was the only reference, but so if anybody wants to read the manifesto, there's a second version. It was in the exhibition catalog, and it's wrapped around this catalog, so you can also get access to this. I think there's still some copies left in the museum. There are some surprises in there, in the manifesto itself. There's some humorous things as well. I particularly like the last article, which says basically it's an article for older people, and the idea that it basically says we will create the conditions for older people to retire, medical facilities and so on. In other words, get out of the way. We're coming. So yeah. And if anyone wants to have a look at this, you're welcome to. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Anthony. That was brilliant and inspired a fit of coughing. I thought it was really interesting the way that you were talking about that your role was to trouble the museum. Was that a role that they bestowed upon you, or is that a role that you enforced upon them?
No, that was my instinct,
Yeah.
I think. But it is interesting. There's an essay in the catalogue, and Gregory Chalette, who's a curator writer in New York, he writes about this. We'd been in an interview, we'd spoken a few times, and this term came up. But yeah, troubling the museum was really important, because to go into to go into a national institution and get comfortable is not going to bring interesting work. And the fact that you're in these kind of institutions, they are problematic. Just referring to traveler culture, it's only very recent that Owen has been appointed head of the traveler collection. And that only really happened in the last 18 months. I mean, there was no real representation of these kind of questions. So I think in Ireland and internationally, there is a movement. We're a little bit behind in some ways. There's now, I believe, the Department of Arts have set up a committee to look at reparation, to look at returns of artifacts. For example, people don't realize we have Benin bronzes in the National Museum collection. So I made a piece of work about this as well.
Thank you. And I think from listening to you speak, that theme of listening really came through. So the listening to the young people, but them listening to each other. But also I really like what Roisin was saying in there about that it's important to listen to younger generations, but when they become an older generation, to listen to the younger generations that are coming through as well. And that kind of that cycle, that virtuous cycle of listening. And I'm curious to know, what from listening to them, what then, how did that influence you?
Yeah, I think listening is a key kind of process. I mean, theoretically, it's well kind of described in socially engaged art practices. It's become a methodology in a sense. But, you know, even instinctively, I think when you work in these situations, you know, they are durational, but having that amount of time to work with different groups and what I'm doing now, what I've been doing over the years, some of the time it's just hanging out with people, being social, you know, going for dinner, going for drinks, whatever, just hanging out. And, you know, if you move into a place in order to understand, you know, what's really at stake for people, you have to listen. You have to listen really carefully. It's not my world sometimes. It's a kind of mediation where I think in social practice where the agency of communities and the agency of artists, they come together at some point. And I think that's where the magic happens, because you start moving in the same direction. So to come back to say we make our own histories, what it coalesced into was this idea of, you know, a future republic to come. It hasn't arrived. But the questions that are being raised and provocations, when visitors came to the museum, there was a space left for them to think about their own position in relation to the future. So it's not a very, you know, I suppose in museum terms, a kind of neo-modernist approach is you look at an object and you kind of interpret it in some way. But what I was trying to do is kind of, you know, make that collaborative, make that more participatory and demand something of the audience as well. I think that's just as important, you know.
And what was that audience response? How were they contributing?
Yeah, I think, you know, there was a lot of workshops that happened around it, but just even anecdotally, talking to people, I think people got it, you know, and you can see what's going on in the everyday politic now that is quite dangerous, you know, and I'm particularly interested in the way Walter Benjamin writes about history. And, you know, it's this kind of return. It's not fixed in time. It's not read as this kind of chronology and linear progression. It's, you know, he uses a term something like, you know, as an image appears in a moment of danger. Well, our moment of danger right now is the rise of the far right. And, you know, not just in Ireland, but everywhere. So being in a national institution like that and imagining it as a transformative space, that isn't passive. That, you know, because if museums contain and really represent national identities, you know, it may not be conscious, but it's certainly happening. So in the way that exhibitions are put together, in the way that collections are curated, accumulatively, it does form a kind of national identity. So what would it look like if that institution was turned back on itself and troubled with the idea of maybe changing methodologies, changing practices? And to some extent, that's kind of started to happen. I think it was in the air anyway, you know, but I think being there and the curators and particularly the education department really being open to that, I can see already there's methods that they've started to use that are really thinking about the collections, thinking about how they bring people in, thinking about how, you know, people who are non-specialists can access these rarefied spaces. Just breaking that down, that's really, really important as well.
Yeah, you often get the sense that staff in organisations want that change to happen, but it takes a kind of an outside voice and outside educators to come in and help to make the case to make it happen as well. Sometimes it's
I think it's safer.
Yeah.
Because you're an external agent. You don't, as an artist, you don't work for the museum. You have this kind of rare, you know, you have this independent space, and yet you're located in a studio. Well, the studio was kind of, you know, put together in the middle of the museum. That's important as well. So you're always present. And it's not just about the curators. It's not just about the keepers. You know, just important to me were, you know, the people who clean the building, the gardeners, the people that I would hang out with every day. They're all part of that infrastructure. And that, you know, really became, for me, you know, part of the residency.
Thank you. Does anyone else have any other questions for Anthony? Yes. Do we have the...
I thought it was interesting. I mean, traditionally artists protest from outside, you know, and
back up against
Right.
institutions. So this idea of actually being a part and participating in democracy was really interesting as an idea. And I wondered how did you start the conversations around the round table? What were the prompts for the direction that it went?
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting because the performative side of things, when you see these, the videos that are made and the documentation around that, it's quite polished. There was a lot of preparation. So part of the collaboration was in the school with the teachers as well, because obviously, I couldn't be there every day, but you're just planting a seed. And actually that's stronger in a sense, because it's not that an artist has to control the minutiae, the everyday, but when you plant that seed and there's buy-in, and suddenly, as I said, everybody's moving, feeling that they're moving in the same direction, it takes on its own life and something changes. And that is the potential transformative action that happens. So there was a lot of work done with history teachers, with the art teachers, doing preparation. Some of the schools I went back to 2 or 3 times. But others, it just took on its own life. And I suppose that's what I was alluding to earlier. There's something about that generation that it wasn't just one-off students who happened to be particularly articulate. There seemed to be like a real, everybody who spoke was just incredibly articulate, had something to say, was passionate about the world, felt that, at that age that they had more kind of, what I would describe as leftist, egalitarian leanings rather than, and really thinking about neoliberalism, thinking about the way the world works, thinking about unfairness, thinking about housing, thinking about homelessness. So of course they were sparked earlier in conversations, but then you just take a giant step back and it emerges, because I think we've all found a place that we decided that we're moving in the same direction at this particular moment. And as an artist, I think that's when the magic happens.
My eye was drawn to what was written on the table, and I loved that the table wasn't this sacrosanct space, and that documentation. So was that an organic thing, or how did that come about? And can you remember some of the things that were written?
Yeah, it's good observation, because I should have stayed on script. I tend not to. I was thinking about, I've made a couple of tables before in different contexts. We brought some of the conversation, some of the workshop notes, and prepared that at the beginning just as a primer. So they were put onto the table. And then just invited everybody who attended to, write their reflections, to draw, to leave some kind of presence that they've been there, including each historian who contributed to the roundtables. They also, left something on the table. And some extraordinary things happened spontaneously as well. I mean, there's a certain amount of contrivance when you construct something that looks like a film set, like here, right? But beyond that, for example, Flora McCarthy, historian, she did something really extraordinary. She kind of, just before it started, she said, can I just do this thing? And she kind of briefly described it, and I was like, yeah, that's amazing. Of course you can do anything. So she brought the group back to 1918, and she asked all the young women at the table to take a step back, and then another step back. And then she asked them, what do you see? And eventually one of the young women said, well, it's a group of men around the table. And she said, yeah, this is a 1918 doll, So she, in this very performative way and very creative way, she led that group to this point of, gender inequality and, how politics performs in our society. So all of this, it's a performance for me in a way. It's how young people perform democracy, and are they conscious of that? And of course, all you're doing is drawing out something that's latent. It's there. It's not something that they had to be taught to do. And again, that's where that's conviction. That's kind of young people thinking for themselves. It's quite a hopeful, optimistic artwork in a way because of that, I think.
I was going to try shout, but I forgot. I was actually at one of the recording sessions. I ended up choosing the Gaelic one, even though I don't speak. Yeah, I don't speak a word of Irish. Upon reflection, I probably should have chosen. But one of the things that really did kind of strike me was that even though I didn't really know what they were saying, it was still incredibly moving. And even like seeing it there up on screen, it's kind of each of them had their own individual rallying call that then kind of becomes this kind of it kind of comes together. But I was just kind of wondering, how did you decide on that structure? Was it purely the logistics of moving the camera around? Because that was a huge part of it, was that kind of production element. And then also the thought process behind making it public, that people could be there in the audience. So yeah, I just thought that side of things.
Again, the proximity to the doll. I spent a couple of days sitting in the Shannon and observing, and I was just for research. I wanted to see how the structure actually works and bring that in some way into this kind of forum. So that, so structurally it was kind of based around that, even down to the way the Ceann Comhairle kind of controlled proceedings. There was a 16th century historic bell that would have a replica that would have been in early political parliamentary formations that was used as well. So there were some subtle things going on, and there were structural things that made the groups feel comfortable. I mean, one of the striking things was because of this kind of flattening out of democracy and hierarchy. When the youngsters came in, of course, they were super nervous. So I brought them into, there's like another room attached to the ceramics room. And we get talking, settle them down a bit. But as soon as they came out and sat down, they just totally got it. Yeah. And they were so confident. You could see it, right? Yeah. And it was incredibly emotional and moving because, I don't know, just, what they had to say. Even the people who weren't speaking, there was no, everybody was just on it. Everybody was like so engaged in that whole process. I think, so it really, part of it was structured. And as you say, part of it was structured because of the, the film crew and so on. And of course that does stilt things in some way, but that is part of that kind of performative aspect of it all, I think. The table is still, it's been dismantled. The museum have it. They haven't really decided what they're going to do with it. There's 7 million artifacts in the museum collection, and they don't have a lot of space. So holding on to it for a little while. I know some people don't want to let it go, but it was never meant to be a permanent thing, But yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. I think we've got time. That's the time. Cheers. Thank you.